About 1,000 years ago, people in a remote high-desert canyon in northwestern New Mexico began building on a scale that still creates problems for archaeologists. Multi-story stone great houses, enormous ceremonial chambers, engineered roads extending across the surrounding basin. And they did it in a landscape where some of the basic materials those projects required were not locally available in anything like sufficient quantities. Today, Chaco Culture National Historical Park protects more than 34,000 acres and roughly 4,000 recorded archaeological sites. But the buildings are only the beginning. Inside the canyon, archaeologists have found timber brought from mountains more than 75 kilometers away, tropical scarlet macaws, cacao, marine shell, copper, a road running for roughly 50 kilometers through sparsely settled country, and in one exceptional burial chamber, DNA connecting generations of people through the same maternal line. Taken separately, each discovery is interesting. Put them together, and a much larger question appears. What exactly was Chaco Canyon? Was this simply a collection of large desert communities, or the center of a system capable of organizing labor, moving rare goods over enormous distances, shaping whole landscapes, and maintaining social relationships across generations? Scientists have become much better at identifying what moved through Chaco. They still disagree about what held Chaco together. These are 10 places where that problem becomes visible. And stay with number 3, because one enormous building is missing something almost every heavily used settlement should leave behind. Number 10. Pueblo Bonito, the desert house connected to a continent. Pueblo Bonito does not look like a small desert village. Its walls curve into a huge D-shaped complex beneath the sandstone cliffs of Chaco Canyon. Room blocks surround plazas and circular kivas. Portions of the northern arc once rose 4 stories. Even the room count becomes complicated. The Chaco Research Archive documents more than 350 rooms on the ground floor. Modern summaries often describe roughly 650 rooms across multiple levels. Older estimates sometimes went higher. Whatever number you use, this was monumental construction. And then archaeologists began looking at what was inside. In the late 1890s, Richard Wetherill and George Pepper excavated 111 cylindrical jars from one part of Pueblo Bonito. For more than a century, the jars remained part of the archaeological record. Then chemistry caught up with them. In 2009, analysis of Pueblo Bonito pottery detected theobromine, a chemical associated with cacao. The study described it as the first demonstrated evidence of cacao consumption north of the Mexican border. That meant something originating far to the south had reached this dry canyon in New Mexico, and cacao was not alone. Pueblo Bonito contained marine shell, copper, large quantities of turquoise, and scarlet macaws. The macaws are difficult to explain away. These are tropical birds. Yet direct radiocarbon dating showed some had reached Pueblo Bonito by roughly CE 900 to 975. That does not prove somebody walked directly from Chaco into tropical Mexico and returned carrying birds. Goods and animals may have moved through intermediary communities, but they moved. Room 38 makes that connection physical. At least 14 scarlet macaws were represented there. 12 skeletons were embedded in roughly 25 centimeters of accumulated bird guano. A tropical bird had somehow become part of life inside a massive stone building in the New Mexico desert. Then another room changed the discussion again. Room 33 contained unusually elaborate burials. In 2017, Douglas Kennett and his colleagues analyzed DNA from people buried there. 9 individuals shared the same mitochondrial genome. Nuclear DNA from the best preserved remains revealed close relationships, including mother and daughter and grandmother and grandson. The researchers interpreted the burials as evidence for a maternal line extending for about 330 years. That is where headlines sometimes race ahead of the evidence and call Chaco a hereditary dynasty. The genetics support something more careful. Close maternal relatives were placed in an exceptional burial context over many generations. Exactly what political authority those people possessed is still debated. But step back from that uncertainty. Cacao came here, macaws came here, shell and copper came here, and certain families appear to have received exceptional burial treatment across centuries. Pueblo Bonito was not behaving like an isolated settlement. By the time modern science had finished with rooms excavated more than a century earlier, the desert ruin had acquired connections reaching far beyond the canyon walls. Number 9. Chetro Kettle, the building that needed a forest. Forget the rooms for a moment. Look at the roof beams. Chaco Canyon does not contain enough suitable large conifer trees to explain the amount of timber used in its great houses. Chetro Kettle alone contained roughly 400 ground and upper-story rooms and more than 10 kivas. Its architecture included a raised plaza, a colonnade, a balcony, and multiple superimposed kivas. Stone could come from the canyon. The roofing problem had to be solved somewhere else. Researchers first approached the question through ecology and isotope analysis. Later, tree ring specialists compared growth patterns in ancient Chaco beams with chronologies from surrounding mountain ranges. One study examined 170 beams from 7 Chaco great houses. 97 came from Chetro Kettle. Across the full sample, roughly 70% matched the Chusca and Zuni mountains, more than 75 kilometers away, and the preferred source changed over time. Before roughly CE 1020, sampled imported timber was dominated by trees from the Zuni Mountains. By around CE 1060, the Chusca Mountains had become dominant. That means a roof beam can preserve two kinds of information at once: the year a tree grew, and the mountain where it grew. Researchers estimate that Chaco's great house construction as a whole ultimately consumed more than 240,000 trees. Every one of those imported beams began somewhere outside the canyon. Whatever organization built Chaco had to obtain the trees, move them across large distances, bring them into the canyon, and incorporate them into multi-story architecture. We do not know the exact labor system that made that happen, but the logistics were real. Chetro Kettle even has a much later chapter that shows how fragile this architecture remains. In August 1947, severe rain sent water into the structure, weakening rooms and collapsing part of the rear wall. Emergency work uncovered around 200 artifacts in one area, many of them fragments of carved and painted wood. Today, preservation crews continue stabilizing the site. The original builders solved the problem of bringing a forest into a desert canyon. Modern crews inherited the problem of keeping the results standing. Number 8. Pueblo Alto and the Great North Road, the road that ends nowhere. Roads are supposed to make destinations easier to understand. This one does the opposite. Just east of Pueblo Alto, a great house on North Mesa with roughly 120 masonry rooms and 18 kivas, traces of an engineered road extend north across the San Juan Basin. The documented route runs for about 50.5 kilometers. Some sections occur as parallel corridors roughly 9 meters wide. Researchers have identified ramps, road traces, and rock-cut stair features, and much of the alignment runs through country with relatively few major settlements, campsites, or obvious resources. Then it reaches the Cuts Canyon landscape. If this were simply a practical transportation route, its design creates awkward questions. Why maintain such strong directional consistency? Why create wide engineered sections through sparsely occupied terrain? Why does the route behave as though direction itself matters? Anna Sofair and other researchers have argued that the Great North Road may have had symbolic or cosmographic meaning. Other archaeologists have proposed practical, political, or mixed functions. Nobody has earned the right to flatten that argument into one answer. The road segments are real. Their purpose remains contested. Technology has actually made the disagreement more interesting. Early researchers used ground survey and aerial photography to trace road-like features. Later, LiDAR analysis recovered about 3.2 kilometers of previously undocumented North Road traces that were difficult to see using conventional imagery. So, better technology confirmed that some faint sections genuinely existed. It did not tell us why somebody built them. There is also disagreement over whether every apparent segment formed one uninterrupted system. Erosion and preservation gaps complicate the reconstruction, but place the road beside Chetro Kettle. One project required bringing huge quantities of timber into the canyon from distant mountains. The other required imposing long, broad geometric lines across the landscape. Different problems, same uncomfortable implication. Chaco required coordination on a scale that is difficult to explain as a collection of unrelated households acting independently. The road can be mapped to the kilometer. The institution behind it cannot. Number 7. Fajada Butte. The calendar that moved. High on Fajada Butte, 3 sandstone slabs stand beside 2 spiral petroglyphs. The slabs are roughly 2 to 3 meters tall. At particular times of year, narrow bands of sunlight move through gaps between them and across the carved spirals. In the 1970s, Anna Sofayer noticed the relationship while documenting rock imagery. In 1979, Sofayer and collaborators published their solar marker interpretation in Science. Their observations connected changing light patterns with solstices and equinoxes. Later work proposed lunar relationships as well. That is how the feature became known as the sun dagger. Then geologists looked at the stones themselves. In 1982, Robert Newman, Robert Mark, and R. Gwyn Vivian concluded that the slabs were probably natural rockfall rather than stones deliberately erected to create an astronomical instrument. That sounds like it destroys the sun dagger interpretation. It does not. It changes it. If the slabs fell naturally, ancestral Pueblo people could still have noticed the unusual light pattern and deliberately positioned the spiral imagery in relation to it. The geological researchers themselves considered that possibility. But possibility is where the evidence stops. The slabs exist. The spirals exist. The changing seasonal light patterns were documented. Whether people deliberately positioned the slabs themselves is not secure. Then modern visitors unintentionally added another chapter. The National Park Service reports that erosion associated with foot traffic contributed to movement of the slabs. The famous beam no longer crosses the center of the spiral exactly as researchers originally documented it. That turned a 1,000-year-old archaeological question into a modern preservation problem. Fajada Butte and the surrounding archaeological area are now closed to general public entry. The irony is difficult to miss. Researchers spent years trying to determine whether ancient people deliberately adjusted the stones. Modern people helped move them anyway. Number 6. Casa Rinconada, the room with a hidden entrance. Casa Rinconada is approximately 19.2 meters across. Around its interior are 34 wall niches, an inner bench, a firebox, roof support pits, and floor vaults. It is the largest excavated Great Kiva in Chaco Canyon. But the most useful detail is underneath it. A subterranean passage about 12 meters or 39 feet long approaches the structure from the north. The architecture could allow someone to enter beneath ground level and emerge inside the ceremonial chamber without using the most obvious visible route. That is the point where narration usually becomes a little too confident. It is easy to picture ritual specialists appearing dramatically inside the kiva. The evidence does not give us that performance. It gives us the passage. Gordon Vivian, Janet Woods, and a University of New Mexico and School of American Research Field School excavated Casa Rinconada in 1931. They exposed a building whose design was clearly deliberate, but architecture does not come with subtitles explaining why each feature existed. Modern observations added another layer. The National Park Service identifies solar alignments at Casa Rinconada and has used the site for equinox and solstice observation programs. That connects it, cautiously, with the broader pattern already visible at Fajada Butte. Chacoan builders were working with buildings, orientation, light, enclosed ceremonial space, and carefully controlled movement. We can describe those physical relationships. Reconstructing the social experience inside them is much harder. Casa Rinconada gives us an entrance with no surviving script for what happened after someone came through it. Number 5. Peñasco Blanco. Did someone paint a star? Exploding? The image is simple enough to fit on one screen. A crescent-like shape, a star-like symbol, a hand. Then comes the date that made the panel famous, July 1054. Astronomers elsewhere recorded a brilliant supernova that year. Because of that event, researchers have long asked whether the Peñasco Blanco pictograph might represent the same thing. The idea works visually. That is exactly why it has survived. The Great House at Peñasco Blanco sits on West Mesa and began developing in the early 10th century with later additions. It contained 4 great kivas and has never undergone a complete formal excavation. The surrounding route also contains extensive ancestral Pueblo and later Navajo rock imagery, so a celestial image here would not be out of place. The problem is that resemblance is not a date. Rock imagery can be difficult to date precisely. A star-like shape does not identify itself. The National Park Service notes that other celestial events and cultural interpretations have also been proposed. Another Chaco petroglyph has even been suggested as a possible record of the total solar eclipse of July 11, 1097. That remains interpretive too. So the Peñasco Blanco panel sits in an awkward but useful category. It is not evidence that can honestly be dismissed as nothing, and it is not evidence that can honestly be turned into a confirmed eyewitness record. The physical image survives. The supernova happened. The 1,000-year-old artist did not leave us a caption. Number 4. Pueblo del Arroyo, Chaco's one-of-a-kind triple wall. Only 10 tri-wall kivas are known across the Southwest, according to the National Park Service. Only one known example is inside Chaco Canyon. It is at Pueblo del Arroyo. The Great House contained roughly 300 rooms and 17 kivas and may have risen as high as 4 stories in places. Its major construction began around the CE 1060s and continued into the early 1100s. Then, among otherwise recognizable Chacoan architectural patterns, someone built concentric walls around a ceremonial structure in a form almost absent from the canyon. Related tri-wall buildings appear elsewhere, especially at Aztec ruins. That resemblance has encouraged arguments about cultural connections and shifting architectural influence. But direction matters. A similar building type does not automatically tell us who influenced whom. What can be said securely is that Pueblo del Arroyo contains an architectural form linking it to a wider regional pattern. Neil Judd's National Geographic expedition excavated much of the Great House during the 1920s. In 1950, National Park Service excavation partly focused on salvaging information from the unusual tri-wall structure. And this is where an earlier object returns. Macaws were not confined to Pueblo Bonito. Ancient macaw DNA analyzed from Pueblo del Arroyo helped connect birds at different southwestern sites to the same broader exotic animal network. The tropical birds therefore appear in more than one part of the canyon's archaeological record. That makes the tri-wall easier to place in the larger story. Again, Chaco refuses to stay inside Chaco. The architecture points outward. So do the birds. Number 3. Wijiji, the Great House, with almost no trash. Now we get to the thing I asked you to remember. Wijiji is one of the most symmetrical great houses in Chaco. When upper stories are included in National Park Service reconstruction, it contained about 225 uniformly sized rooms. The rear section rose roughly 3 stories, and much of that construction appears to have happened quickly. The National Park Service places the major building surge at roughly CE 1110 to 1115, 5 years. That is unusually concentrated compared with great houses expanded and altered over many generations. And yet Wijiji is missing something archaeologists would normally expect around a building of this size. A typical midden, a concentrated trash deposit. That sounds mundane until you understand what garbage represents. A large building can impress you with walls. Refuse tells you whether people were actually generating the ordinary residue of sustained occupation around those walls. At Wijiji, that expected signal is unusually weak. There is also no great kiva in the plaza. Those absences have led some researchers to suggest the complex may never have been fully completed or used in the way its scale seems to imply. That interpretation is plausible. It is not proven. Wijiji remains unexcavated, which is important. Much of its archaeological context is still intact, rather than having been completely opened during an older excavation campaign. Future work may therefore have more to say about how this building functioned. For now, the contradiction survives. A highly symmetrical great house, hundreds of reconstructed rooms, a short building surge, and surprisingly little of the ordinary refuse expected around a heavily used complex. At Pueblo Bonito, exotic objects revealed connections stretching outward. At Wijiji, the most useful clue may be what people failed to leave behind. Number 2. Hungo Pavi. The ruin archaeologists, mostly left alone. Hungo Pavi looks less dramatic precisely because archaeologists have not turned most of it inside out. The National Park Service describes more than 150 rooms, a great kiva, and an enclosed plaza. But much of the architecture remains beneath wind-blown sand and native vegetation. That makes Hungo Pavi valuable for a different reason. Excavation reveals things. It also permanently changes the context being excavated. Leaving large portions of a site buried preserves relationships that future researchers may be able to study using methods that do not exist yet. Hungo Pavi therefore gives visitors something places like Pueblo Bonito cannot, a sense of how a major Chacoan great house can look before rooms are systematically exposed and stabilized. There is a visible stair feature in the cliff area behind the site, and historic stabilization records survive. But the central image here is simpler. More than 150 rooms are present. Most of them do not announce themselves as walls. They remain under the ground. At Hungo Pavi, restraint is part of the archaeology. Number 1. Una Vida. One life, 1,000 years later. Una Vida means one life. The ground has had several. It is one of Chaco's earliest great houses, alongside Pueblo Bonito and Peñasco Blanco. Tree ring evidence places its earliest building activity in the mid-800s. Construction continued in several stages until roughly CE 1100. The Chaco Research Archive estimates around 160 rooms. But Una Vida was never stripped open on the scale of Pueblo Bonito. The National Park Service describes much of it as remaining in a near-natural condition, with limited excavation and repair. So the building survives partly as masonry and partly as a mound. Nearby sandstone carries petroglyphs, and then the site crosses into another period entirely. Historic Navajo hogans and a corral were later built on the same mounded ruin. That matters because Chaco is often described in language that makes the place sound as though a civilization simply appeared, built monuments, and vanished. The archaeological landscape is more complicated. People kept using this ground. Different communities remained connected to this landscape long after the Great House era, and modern preservation now deliberately leaves much of Una Vida covered, rather than exposing every surviving wall. The contrast with Pueblo Bonito is useful. At Pueblo Bonito, science kept pulling more information out of things excavated generations ago. At Una Vida, part of the scientific value comes from what has not yet been opened. One site keeps producing answers from old collections. The other preserves questions for people who have not arrived yet. The name says, one life. The landscape does not. And this is where the 10 places stop behaving like 10 separate mysteries. Put them together. At Pueblo Bonito, tropical macaws, cacao, shell, copper, and unusual burials point to relationships extending far beyond one canyon. At Chetro Kettle, tree rings trace construction timber back to mountain forests more than 75 kilometers away. At Pueblo Alto, broad engineered roads impose geometry across the basin, even though archaeologists still debate what those roads were for. At Fajada Butte and Casa Rinconada, architecture, rock imagery, sunlight, and ceremonial space intersect in ways that are physical enough to document but difficult to translate into precise ancient intentions. At Pueblo del Arroyo, a rare building form and another group of macaws connect Chaco to patterns beyond itself. And at Wijiji, something as ordinary as missing trash complicates assumptions about what these enormous buildings were actually doing. That is the larger discovery. Chaco Canyon was not simply a remote place where people happened to build unusually large stone houses. The archaeological evidence points to long-distance exchange, enormous construction logistics, coordinated landscape projects, exceptional treatment of particular families, and connections reaching into other parts of the Southwest and beyond. What remains unsettled is the institution at the center of all of that. Was Chaco primarily a political center, a ceremonial center, a regional gathering place, a system held together by elite families, a combination of several things that our modern categories separate too neatly? The evidence does not currently force one answer, but it does force a different picture of the canyon. The ruins are the easiest part to see. The system that made them possible is the harder discovery. If one of these changed how you see Chaco Canyon, tell me which one. And if you want more documentaries built around what the evidence actually says, rather than what makes the easiest headline, subscribe for the next one.